Hey everyone, and welcome back to What's the Plan, the podcast where we dive into the matters of our careers in the architecture and urban planning field. I'm Hayley.
And I'm Andrea. So, Hayley, what's the plan this week?
This week's plan is all about homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into that, Andrea, when you hear the word homeless, what do you think of? What do you picture?
I picture people who live on the streets, so people who do not have a physical shelter to go to every night. So instead, they would rely on just sleeping on top of perhaps vents or places in corners and crevices of exterior buildings.
Yeah, for sure. Typically, when people hear the term homeless, or when we talk about someone who is homeless, we think about individuals who live on the streets. For someone that's lived in Toronto for 5 years, you probably picture the people who live on the side of the streets by Eaton Center, for example, where it's really busy, there's a lot of people, and that's what typically people think of. But what most people might not realize is that homelessness encompasses a wide range of physical living situations. In Canada, there are actually 4 different typologies of homelessness. The first is unsheltered or absolutely homeless and living on the streets or in places that aren't intended for human habitation. Individuals under this typology lack housing and aren't accessing emergency shelters or accommodations except in the event of extreme weather conditions. So this is where we'd categorize the typical understanding of homelessness that I mentioned earlier and that you first thought of. But in addition to that, people who secretly live in private and vacant buildings, who are also known as squatters, as well as people who live in their cars, garages, attics, closets, or makeshift shelters, shacks, or tents also fall under this category because these spaces and places aren't intended for permanent human habitation. The second typology is emergency sheltered. This is where people are accessing emergency shelter and system supports that aren't generally provided at no or minimal cost because they can't secure permanent housing. Some reasons why individuals would be accessing these emergency shelters could be because they are absolutely homeless, or even if they needed to flee their homes because of family violence or natural disasters like fires or floods. Due to the availability of these shelters, a lot of them are short-term, meaning individuals would have to leave by the morning, so they act solely as a place to sleep, while others may allow people to stay on an ongoing basis. Within the second category of homelessness, we can see a stopgap institutional response to the issue through providing shelters by government, nonprofit, faith-based organizations, or even just volunteers. Third, we have provisionally accommodated, which refers to those whose accommodation is temporary or lacks security or tenure. This can also be seen as hidden homeless because many people don't realize that individuals under this category are still considered homeless. Although individuals under this category may have a safe space to sleep at night, the lack of security and confirmation of how long they can stay at these accommodations causes this to be an issue. Some examples of this category would include interim housing for people who are homeless, which is a systems-supported form of housing that's meant to bridge the gap between homelessness and permanent housing. People living temporarily with others, but without guarantee of continued residency or immediate prospects for accessing permanent housing, which would include couch surfers that stay with family or friends and sometimes even strangers. People accessing short-term temporary rental accommodations, such as people who make temporary rental arrangements at motels, rooming houses, or other places where they pay a fee, but there's no possibility of permanency. Other examples of individuals in this category would be people in institutional care and lack permanent housing arrangements, and this could be for reasons like being homeless prior to being admitted, or even in cases where these individuals had housing prior to admittance, but either lost their housing while in institutional care or can't go back due to changes in their needs. Recently arrived immigrants and refugees who rely on accommodation and reception centers before being able to secure their own housing would also be an example of provisionally homeless. The fourth and final typology of homeless as classified in Canada is the at-risk of homelessness category. Although this typology would mean that these individuals living in housing that is intended for permanent human habitation and could potentially become permanent, they're highly at risk of becoming homeless as a result of internal hardships such as poverty, personal crisis, discrimination, lack of other available or affordable housing, or inappropriateness of their current housing. I personally think that this is the most important typology that we need to learn about when talking about homelessness, because this is the type of homelessness that so many of us, myself included, don't realize is an issue. Because it doesn't matter what the level of probability to losing their current home is, anyone that can be categorized under this typology have the vulnerability that at any moment, a single trigger is all it takes for them to lose their homes. And I think that's really scary to think about. Under this typology, it's also important to make a distinction between the two subgroups, one being people at imminent risk of homelessness, and the other being individuals or families who are precariously housed. People who are at imminent risk of homelessness may face many contributing factors, and in most cases is the onset of a crisis, a turn of events, or the increase of acuity for one or more underlying risk factors. Some of these factors may include precarious employment, sudden unemployment, supported housing with supports that are being discontinued, households that are facing eviction, severe and persistent mental illness, active addictions, substance use and or behavioral issues, division of households, violence or abuse in current housing situations, or institutional care that's inadequate or unsuited. On the other hand, individuals and families who are precariously housed are at risk of being homeless because they are experiencing severe housing affordability problems due to their income or local economy, or other things that are out of their control, such as the physical structure of the dwelling. Now that we've covered the four typologies of homelessness in the Canadian context, let's address some of the myths surrounding homelessness. Andrea, off the top of your head, can you think of some misconceptions about being homeless?
I think one of the major misconceptions is that a lot of people choose to be homeless rather than like there are exterior factors that kind of force them, and then rather than like actually validating their reasons for wanting to leave a house, it's like saying like you chose to leave the house and therefore you chose to be homeless. But it's like it's not always that easy.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually the biggest myth that comes along with being homeless. Other myths about homelessness include people who experience homelessness are lazy.
Oh, for
All
sure.
people who
Heard that before.
experience, yeah, all people who experience homelessness are addicts. People experiencing homelessness should just get a job. And so these three myths that I just covered go along with the first myth that you discussed. And again, it's such a stereotype that is so incorrect because we don't know the situations of the individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So there's no way that we can identify whether or not they're actually lazy, whether or not they can actually get a job, or if they chose to leave their homes, and even if they did choose to, what the reasons behind leaving their homes were.
Yeah, and then like I think another part of like the third thing you mentioned about like people who are homeless are also always assumed or presumed to be addicts. It's like you hear that a lot when especially some of these homelessness might be asking for spare change. A lot of people say like, "Oh, I don't want to give them money because I don't know what they're gonna do with it." And when they say that, they mean like,
Yes.
"Oh, I think they're just gonna use the money to buy drugs."
Actually, I have this conversation a lot with my partner. He is the type of person that would, uh, whenever possible, if someone were to ask him for some spare change, if he has it on him, he would give the money. And I think the first time that I saw him do that, I did ask him what he thought about what you just mentioned. Like, I thought, does it matter to you how they spend the money? Like, what if they do use it for drugs? Not that I was assuming, but I was just curious on what his viewpoint was. And he brought up a very good point, being that once I give, or like once he gave the money away, the money is no longer his to decide what to do with. So once he's parted ways with the money, like it doesn't matter what the person you gave the money to does with it, because you already made the choice. And I think that's a really good perspective to have, and I think that's a perspective that everyone should have. Other myths surrounding homelessness is that there are plenty of adequate services and supports to help homeless communities, and property values will go down if we let homeless shelters into our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Which, again, is...
And not even just homeless shelters, it's like affordable housing too. There's a lot of times that, like, Toronto neighborhoods, they want to include affordable housing in a certain area, but a lot of people that live there already, they're like, we don't want that because they think it would decrease their value.
Yeah, exactly. And so not only are these myths generalizations of a more complicated reality, it's so harmful for the general public to believe this because it only furthers the hate and degradation that individuals experiencing homelessness face on a day-to-day basis.
So now, looking at it from the Canadian perspective in regards to homelessness in Canada, the word homelessness was not used to describe a social problem in Canada until the early to mid 1980s. And the reasoning behind that there was a shift from ensuring that people had access to safe, secure housing in neighborhoods to more an international focus that looked at increasing numbers of unhoused people in wealthier developed countries, including Canada. As well, mass homelessness of Canada emerged around this time as a result of government cutbacks to social housing and related programs starting in 1984. And in 1993, the federal government decided spending money on the construction of new social housing should come to an end. And in 1996, the federal government actually transferred responsibility for most existing federal low-income social housing to the provinces as a way for them to not have to deal with the problem anymore. And now coming to today is, as for the context of Toronto, homelessness is a complex and urgent and growing issue. There are approximately 8,700 people in Toronto who are experiencing homelessness, which is quite an alarming number. I don't know about you, but like I have trouble like picturing 8,700 people just like at the top of my head in general. So to have that number to represent homeless people in Toronto is quite alarming. And as you mentioned earlier, there are actually a lot more people that are experiencing hidden homelessness. So we don't actually know if this number is actually the true value. And as well, there's thousands of others are on the wait list for supportive housing, which is also not included in this number. There are many reasons why or how people end up homeless, but to get a better picture, let's dive into the statistics. So for every 10,000 people in Toronto, 30 are homeless. So let's say your neighborhood has like 10,000 people. However, there are not 10,000 houses for every people. So you have 30 people in that neighborhood without a home. And in 2018, nearly half of Toronto's homeless population reported being homeless for over 6 months, which makes them chronically homeless. So imagine 6 months without a home, or like some people even have trouble not having a home for one night. And in addition, like over 30% of Toronto's homelessness live with a mental health issue, and over 25% live with an addiction. So because they don't have a home, they don't have a support system to help them with their issues and problems. So a lot of times it worsens. And 94% of these experiencing homelessness in Toronto want permanent housing. So like another myth is like they're not lazy and they don't want to be housed. They do, but there are a lot of barriers in securing it. And in addition to the option of emergency shelters only being like temporarily for one night, another reason why a lot of people don't turn to these resources is that a lot of times the occupancy rate in Toronto shelters are like 98% full. So there's not enough space for everybody that wants it. And it's estimated that 1,500 people sleep outside in Toronto as a result of the housing crisis that saw over 100,000 households waitlisted for social housing in 2019 and over 9,000 people homeless. And with a housing list of over 12 years long, like Toronto has no long-term strategy for housing. And as a result, like with the pandemic has resulted in a lot of people losing their precarious work. A lot of people have decreased wages, and a lot of people are getting evicted because of just a lot of laws that are not being enforced anymore. And as a result, much like everything else, COVID has played a huge role in the rise of encampments. So prior to COVID, many people lived in encampments. However, they were largely invisible because they were, first and foremost, pushed out of sight by law enforcement, and they were also criminalized. So what police would do is that they would go around these encampments, and either they would destroy them or they would ticket the people, which carry fines up to like $1,000. And as a result of COVID and a lot of people not having access to emergency shelters, the city of Toronto made them no longer illegal. A lot of people moved into existing encampments. And as of June 5th, there were 14 current COVID outbreaks and 528 confirmed cases in shelters, which as a result, a lot of people do not want to go up to turn to shelters in the event that they do catch COVID themselves. Whereas on the other hand, encampments have resulted or have been tested for COVID-19 and there were 0 cases. So it's like sort of a no-brainer why people choose to go to encampments rather than shelters.
Another reason why I feel like encampments would be more attractive than living at shelters is because of the violence that often happens in shelters. Because like as society, we don't take shelters seriously enough. And so as a result, there's so much stigma behind it. And not a lot of people want to work in the shelters or volunteer their time at shelters, resulting in very low security. And so oftentimes a lot of people who would seek out these shelters, they worry about not only getting injured or hurt, but also having the few items that they own stolen, which if you think about only having those 5 things, for example, in your life that you can tie your name to, and the thought of having one of them taken away from you, that is just another very heartbreaking reason why a lot of people choose to stay outside in the cold, in extreme weather conditions, just to avoid being in these shelters that don't have enough security around.
And now that the city of Toronto is beginning to open up for business from the lockdown, city officials are evicting people from encampments and moving them into different temporary living situations. And some of these temporary living situations include hotel programs such as the one that's occurring at the Novotel Hotel. However, many people have expressed that these temporary housing solutions are part of a strategy to increase invisibility to homelessness rather than provide permanent housing. And also, a lot of times, the city officials don't actually bring people or encampment residents to these temporary solutions. Rather than they just say, we are providing this, but not actually like showing for it. And to make things even worse, the city is claiming that the removal of these encampments are vital to make the park safer and accessible to other residents as well. And when they mean safer, they use encampment fires and unhealthy living environments as reasonings. In reality, they mean safer for the residents who don't actually live in the encampments, rather who really just want to use it for like an afternoon for a couple of hours and stuff like that. So as a result, tensions arise and conflicts ensue. And the most recent eviction occurred a little over 3 weeks ago on May 19th at Lamport Stadium Park in Liberty Village, where roughly over 60 City of Toronto corporate security guards and police officers, 6 people in hazmat suits, and a handful of other city workers, alongside with 2 heavy clog excavators and 3 dump trucks, attempted to clear the encampment. And despite city officials saying that we will be offering temporary solutions, no residents that day were actually offered housing. Unfortunately, residents were able to hold their ground with the help of community members, and only 10% of the encampment was destroyed, which was consisting of about 1 tent and 2 temporary makeshift shelters. And however, a lot of people didn't leave unscathed. There were several encampment residents who attempted to defend a shelter, and as a result, the police ended up using force, and a lot of residents were either punched, trampled, and or temporarily held in court services vehicles. It's not a good look for City of Toronto.
Wow.
And like this goes to show you that you cannot rely on the city to do right by encampment residents, but rather a lot of people rely on external organizations to help.
And so now that we do have a better understanding of the homeless situation in Toronto, we're going to talk a little about a few organizations that are helping and trying to make a change. First, we have Toronto Community Housing, or TCH. TCH is the largest social housing provider in Canada and the second largest in North America. It was created by the City of Toronto on January 1st of 2002, and it's mandated by the Province of Ontario's Housing Services Act and operates in a non-profit manner. TCH's core mission is to provide clean, safe, well-maintained, affordable homes for residents through collaboration and with residents' needs at the forefront. Toronto Community Housing has 2,100 buildings and 50 million square feet of residential space in 106 of the 140 neighborhoods in Toronto. And they also provide homes to nearly 60,000 low and moderate income households. They receive 55% of their operating funding from rent paid by residents, while 39% come from subsidies from the City of Toronto and 6% from rental of commercial spaces and income from investments. As a social housing provider, TCH's mandate is to do more than a typical landlord and are responsible for meeting the requirements set out by the city. There are 6 core services that are defined for TCH as a social housing provider, which includes clean buildings, well-maintained buildings, revitalization and renewal, community building partner, tenancy management and supports, and tenant safety. So, as I mentioned earlier about the lack of security in a lot of shelters, one good thing that TCH does is that with the mandate, Toronto Community Housing, there is a need and a realization to put tenant safety first. And so TCH serves as a great example of ways that the government could and should get involved to help the more vulnerable population have safe and secure housing.
So separate from the City of Toronto, there is a organization called Encampment Support Network, and these are the people that played a vital role as community support in the encampment eviction that happened last month. And who they are an ad hoc volunteer run network supporting people living in encampments in 6 locations throughout Toronto. And these locations include Parkdale, Trinity Bellwoods, Scatting Court, Moss Park, LMP, and Cherry Beach. And how they help is that these networks visit encampments daily to deliver basic supplies that the city has constantly refused to provide. And these supplies include, but are not limited to, water, tents, ice, especially on a hot summer day, sleeping bags, fire safety equipment, and snacks. And they do this because they believe all people deserve care, support, and access to water, fire safety, and sanitation. And in addition to on-ground support, they advocate for better conditions in encampments. They report on city conditions and activity in encampments. They advocate for long-term permanent housing for people in their communities of choice. And they collect and compile feedback from residents to support their advocacy efforts and pressure the city to develop real solutions to the housing crisis. So you can see what their works and their advocations through social media and their website. And especially on times of when there are tensions, they are there to live report so everybody knows what happens. And as I was doing research into the Encampment Support Network, I found another organization that does something similar, but in a different aspect, and they are the Shelter and Housing Justice Network. They are a network of homelessness and housing advocates, shelter providers, healthcare professionals, faith leaders, legal workers, and researchers who have come together to address the issue of homelessness in Canada on a local, provincial, and national level. So these are professions or people who have professions that can provide like pro bono or support in homelessness in other ways besides like day-to-day needs. And they aim to seek immediate action and long-term sustainable solutions in the shelter and housing sectors. And they are helping by ensuring safety, dignity, and autonomy for those experiencing homelessness. And they do so by ensuring access to housing for all, regardless of their age, their race, their faith, gender identity, sexual orientation, their abilities, their incomes, or immigration status. And they also advocate the reestablishment of a national housing program in Canada. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of it got decentralized from the federal and moved towards the provincial level. So having a national housing program will better support everybody in Canada and not just some areas in the country. As well, enhancing access to critical services and supports not only assist individuals and families currently experiencing homelessness, but also to prevent those who are at risk of becoming homeless from being forced to live on the streets or in precarious circumstances.
Although homelessness is a huge problem in Toronto, there are cities that are doing a good job in trying to eradicate homelessness. For instance, in recent years, Finland has been the only country in Europe where homelessness has decreased. The reason behind this is due to the adoption of the Housing First policy in 2008. This concept was pioneered by Don Bosco in the late 19th century, who insisted that the basic needs of people be met first without needing to comply with various rules and regulations prior to receiving the service. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about providing people with what they need without judgment on what they are doing to receive the need. Finland took this principle in 2007 and developed the goal to eliminate homelessness in the country by 2015, with a focus on the 10 biggest urban growth centers where most of homelessness is found. The Finnish model of this concept has 4 principles. The first one is that permanent housing enables people to live independently. Secondly, people can choose how to engage with services, and completely giving up intoxicants is not a requirement. I personally really admire the second principle because this is a harm reduction strategy that respects the individual's autonomy, and it also reminds us that addiction is a disease and most often isn't a choice. The third principle is that staff meet clients as equals and aim to build trust and empower them, rather than seeing them as projects that need fixing. And the fourth and final principle is to support people's integration into their community and help them build strong networks. So although the Housing First concept has been implemented in various places over the world, the Finnish model is unique because it's tailored more individually around the needs of the residents rather than stereotyping everyone into one giant group. Finland also makes this work successfully because of the higher standard of public social services the country has compared to others, such as in the United States. And ultimately, the greatest notes to take out of Finland's success in the reduction of homelessness is that the country believes and acts on the cooperation between the state, city councils, and third sector organizations in order to invoke possible change. Another contrasting note is that in Finland, Housing First isn't viewed as a project, but rather a wholesale change to the country's housing policy, which is a really important viewpoint to the homelessness situation, because homelessness is an issue that can exist at any time, and so viewing it as a single project that has the possibility to never exist again, although ideal, isn't the best way to go about it.
So, similar to Finland, the city of Medicine Hat in Alberta, just at the beginning of the month, announced that they have successfully put an end to homelessness. And they have achieved what is called functional zero chronic homelessness, which means they have been able to prove that there were no more than 3 individuals experiencing chronic homelessness in the community for 3 months. And by definitions of the Canadian standard, chronic homelessness is someone who has experienced 6 months of homelessness over the past year, or someone who's experienced recurrent homelessness for 18 months over the past 3 years. So not only is this quite significant that they're able to accomplish such a feat, but also they're the first Canadian city to ever reach this achievement. However, this is not actually the first time that Medicine Hat made news for being the first and only Canadian city to end homelessness. They actually first accomplished this back in 2015 based on an assessment system that they had to design themselves because none of it existed.
Wow.
None of them existed at that time. So unlike today, they actually accomplished this following under the federally approved system that follows the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, or CAEH for short. And with a cohesive federal system, it has drastically made it easier for other cities to join and track their progress through a campaign called Built for Zero. So back to Medicine Hat. So how did they do this? And exactly like Finland, in 2009, Medicine Hat implemented a housing first program called the Medicine Hat Community Housing Society, or MHCH for short. And this is a decade-long program which began with creating a central list known as a by name list, which becomes a real-time database of those experiencing homelessness. And from there, they turned that list from people, from numbers, into names, and allowed officials to understand the context of their homelessness and their level of need, such as whether or not they have children. And from there, a referral to the most appropriate program is made. And some of the notable programs within this are permanent supportive housing, which links permanent affordable housing with flexible volunteer support services to assist with housing retention and independent living, as well as a graduate rental assistance initiative, which is an ongoing financial assistance in the form of rent supplements to eligible individuals and families that have graduated from the Housing First programs. And just looking at statistical results, since 2009, more than 1,323 homeless people, 358 of them who are chronic homeless, have acquired a place to live. And of those 1,323 people, 328 of these were actually children. So today, Medicine's Hat plan is still grounded in their Housing First approach and is consistent with the several principles established in the provincial plan for Alberta, which are: number 1, everyone has access to safe, affordable, accessible, and permanent housing. 2, addressing the root causes of homelessness is essential to ending homelessness. 3, preventing and ending homelessness is a shared responsibility of all orders of the government, the community, the corporate sector, the service providers, and citizens. 4th, the programs and services are evidence-informed in their planning, and they demonstrate measurable outcomes. So keeping track of the number of people that have experienced homelessness and people that have found permanent housing is important to know that whether or not you're actually doing work. And 5th, the current essential services and supports are maintained during the transition to permanent housing. So making sure that they're supported every step of the way and that there is no chance for slipping. 6, goals and initiatives are program participant-centered and community-driven. And the final one being funding is a long-term, predictable, and aligned with a community plan to end homelessness. So you can't do this without everybody supporting it.
Until every city, province, or country institutes a Housing First program, homelessness will continue to exist. But despite that, there are things that we as the public and as an average citizen can do.
Yeah, so Hayley, what do you suggest we can do to help?
I think the greatest and most important thing that we as the public, as the general population can do is advocate for the homeless population and change the narrative. So what I mean by change the narrative is that, like the first question that I asked you on this episode, what do we think about what do you think of when you hear the term homeless? And with that, there's that stereotypical description of what it means to be homeless, and that, along with so many other narratives, need to be changed in order for homelessness as an issue to be taken seriously and to be able to find proper solutions to help eradicate the issue. Another way that we can change the narrative is that we should stop talking about people who are experiencing homelessness as if they are the problem, rather than actually being homeless that is the problem. We also should normalize providing support for individuals who are facing homelessness. And what I mean by this is, for example, when you brought up Medicine Hat and how they chose to create a new program because there wasn't any in place, that should be more normalized. And although it is amazing and we should definitely praise them for it, it should become a regular thing that is so common that we don't need to single out towns and cities who are doing this to help the situation. Another important thing I think we can do is learn to separate the individuals from the situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like, rather than looking at homelessness as like an individualistic issue that like affects only a certain amount of people, it's like it's actually a systemic issue. There are a lot of factors that the government, the society like has in play that results in these people being homeless. And if we don't solve those problems and we don't acknowledge that those problems are related, it's like you'll never actually be able to help them.
Can you think of any other ways that we can help as the general population?
So I definitely agree with the four main points that you have made. So in addition to that, there are some suggestions that actually the encampment support network have provided for people. And the first one is to respect people's agency. What respecting people's agency mean is that respect their decision to choose their own living situations. And if they want to stay in encampments, like let them stay in encampments if they want. The city should repeal bylaws that criminalize people camping in public space. Because after all, it is public space. And the second suggestion they have said is welcome encampment residents to your neighborhood. So respectfully offer them material supporting to fulfill basic needs like water, food, tents, and so on, rather than sending notices to the city every single day saying like you must get rid of this. It's like no, these people have a right to be in the space. It's like because the city is not able to provide a house for them. So it's like rather than like trying to get rid of them in attempts to think in your mind solve the problem, you should do the reverse and ask the city to actually do something for them. Another thing that people can do is actually donate. So the campus support networks and a lot of other external organizations rely entirely on donations to deliver essentials to encampment residents. So every dollar that anyone can give counts. And finally, contact city officials. What they're saying is tell John Tory, tell the city to provide rent-geared income housing options for people in encampments that have the social and have the social supports that they need. So like don't fall for the short-term strategy. So don't fall for these like hotel shelters and like temporary shelter solutions, and take action right to their municipal government. And to make that all easier for you to do so, the Encampment Support Network actually have the letter template available on their website for you to use.
And not only is it important for those of us who have never experienced homelessness before to understand that every homeless individual faces a different and complex set of circumstances that we don't know about and we don't need to know about. But it's the responsibility of every one of us to educate ourselves about these issues and help whenever and wherever we can, because everyone deserves to be dignified and treated with respect regardless of our circumstances.
So just a final food for thought. I saw this tweet on Twitter written by Nahid Dasani, who occasionally works with the Shelter and Housing Justice Network. He is a palliative care doctor who advocates for health and human rights, and he says that a hospital bed costs $10,000 and $10,900 a month to fund. A provincial jail bed costs $4,333 a month. A shelter bed costs $1,932 a month, but social housing only costs $199.92 a month. So why not save money, and why not also save lives?
I think that's a mantra we should go by.
Yeah.
So eradicating homelessness is the plan for now. Listen to our next episode to continue figuring it out with us.
Thanks for following along to this episode. If you liked it, please give it a like, review, and subscribe for more. Until then, follow us on Instagram at What's the Plan Podcast for what the next plan is.